So we are continuing with the same paragraph where Wordsworth describes how mind ultimately reaches a state of savage torpor. And if you reread the same lines, it is primarily based on Wordsworth's earlier notion when he says that feelings which are developed after feelings are given importance to the action and situation, and it should not be otherwise. So for him, whatever external actions, situations, contexts, and incidents are taking shape, the feelings formed after, or the kind of impact created upon someone's persona, especially the poet's persona, is something that is depicted through feelings, and it is these feelings who give importance to these actions and incidents. The same he's trying to elaborate how the mind has become, for particularly in these lines, and let me take it directly from the text. For a multitude of causes unknown to the former times, now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion, to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. So here he describes how the mind now, when it is burdened with, or it is made bewildered, it is made vague, it is made little bit of shadowy and foggish with the use of discriminatory powers or the external combined powers, whatever external incidents that are happening, that somewhere make the power of the mind to and it reduces the power of the mind to almost savage lethargy. And why that's the case? Now here he's clearly referring to the historical context in which the 1790s people were undergoing, when the people of England were subjected to so much changes, so much movement, so much constant external influences. Then of course the poetic mind, or the poetic speech the poetic mind can never think of its composition, or it can never produce its point of reference as to be the one based on the feelings. It will always be relying on the external incidents only. In other words, for the poetic production to take place, their meaningful field of reference would always be these general political and social influences, these general political and social transformations, these general socio-political changes that are taking shape. So a poet's point of reference becomes something which is outside. So how can mind, which has based its focus entirely on the events outside, can think of writing something based on feelings? So this is where he has argued that because of the external historical contingent, which is of course very contingent, what was happening during 1790s were every day it was a different day for these Britons, and they were subjected to these constant influx of change every day, which marked for the poet somewhere as a completely different and completely in a different context field of reference for their poetic production. And this, as a result, he says, there is a consistent loss of a stable and meaningful field of reference, because majorly the poet has now based his point of reference, or the field of reference now has shifted to outside. It is entirely dependent on the everyday changes that is going on in the political or social life of England. So, of course, the aesthetic part of it has certainly diminished, because the focus now has shifted not on the feeling, or rather on the things outside. And this is what he's raging his argument against. So let's now once again read the text. For a multitude of causes, that is, these multitude of causes happening outside in the external world, which were unknown to the former times, they are now acting with a combined force to blunt, to bewilder, to make it vaguish, to make it shadowy. Whom is it trying to make it shadowy? To the powers of mind, and as a result it has reduced these external causes, these multitude of causes has reduced the state of mind to almost savage torpor. Torpor, I already told you, to savage lethargy. And the next line he says, the most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place. Exactly the same context that we talked of just now. And in the very next line, he clearly states, to this tendency of life and manners, the literature and theatrical exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves. That is, to this field of reference. And what is that field of reference? This life outside, these mannerisms outside, the upheaval that are, or the influx that is changing, that is taking shape every day in the outside world. Literature has limited itself, literature has conformed itself to these external mannerisms, to these tendencies of life. And then he says, the invaluable works of our elders that I've said somewhere else, of Shakespeare and Milton, they were driven into neglect now. By whom? By some frantic novels, some stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse. Again, he's making a direct reference, a direct attack to the notion of epic poetry that should have everything grandiose and sublime in nature. He says, sublimity is not the result of when you take up the best of the people or the extraordinary people and describe there are some insurmountable feat through your verse form. It is when you talk of the ordinary things and you raise it, the description of it is raised to such a level that it reaches the sublime manners of the mind. Now, after this, let's continue with the next line. When I think upon this degrading thirst after outrageous stimulation, when I think upon this degrading thirst after external or outside stimulation, I am almost ashamed to have spoken of my feeble endeavor made in these volumes to counteract it. Now, to counteract it, this is the last line we are reading of this paragraph, and I would want you all to leave these 3-4 lines. These are nothing but the subordinate clauses that are attached to the primary line. That is, he is disgusted, first of all, that the poets or the literates have now found their thirst is finally satisfied with outrageous stimulation, or something which is stimulation which is existing outside, and he has almost on his part tried to compensate for this by bringing out this volume. So he sees this general outrageousness, or not this general outrageousness, but this general tendency of looking for outside stimulation as a kind of general evil. He sees this thirst of the literates of looking outside or for external stimulation as part of their field of reference as to be some sort of evil that has crept in literature and almost other theatrical parts of the world, across different countries as well, right? So we will read from when I think upon this degrading thirst till counteracted, and we will leave the remaining subordinated clauses to continue from this line, that the time is approaching when the evil will be systematically opposed. Let me repeat it again. So what I want you all to do right now, the reading should happen in such a manner that when I think of these degrading thirsts after outrageous stimulation, this line to be continued till counteracted, and then leave 4-5 lines and continue from that the time is approaching when the evil will be systematically opposed. So pause your audio and reread it. I'm going to begin with when I think upon this degrading thirst for outrageous stimulation till counteracted, and then I'll continue from that the time is approaching when the evil will be systematically opposed. Let me read it now. I am almost ashamed to have spoken of the feeble endeavor made in these volumes to counteract it. Now again, he's saying that he has made a kind of compensation, some weak endeavor on his part to compensate for this kind of external stimulation that was a common sight by the poets during those times, and he regards this as some sort of general evil. And then he says that the time is also approaching when this evil will be systematically opposed. Why the time is approaching because with the initiation of the romantic thought, with the landmark kind of discovery and, of course, invention onto the literary landscape of British literature of the romantic temperament, these all evils will be systematically opposed. How? Because men of great powers, that is, poets and writers who will conform to this kind of aesthetic theory, will be far more successful, far more distinguished as compared to the previous ones. Right? Now let's give it a quick reading, a continued reading to the same paragraph. The invaluable works of our elder writers, of Shakespeare and Milton. So what I'm doing is I'm abridging the text and I'm reading out only the important clauses in these sentences. All the extraneous information I'm escaping so that you get an idea of or you can make sense out of these sentences. Let me reread it. The invaluable works of our elder writers, that is the works of Shakespeare and Milton, they are driven into neglect by frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse, that is epic. But and when I think of this degrading thirst of some of the literates and poets and writers after these outrageous external stimulation, I am very much ashamed, and as a result I have spoken as part of my feeble endeavor to make this volume and to counteract it. So I am trying to compensate and giving a kind of befitting reply, a counter discourse to whatever has gone already, or whatever poets have written through theory and through verse form as well. And reflecting upon the magnitude of this general evil that is so great that most of these poets, these novelists, these theatrical, whether theatrical dramatists or playwrights or even other people who were writing, for example, even of the diarist or an essayist, they were again doing nothing but a kind of documentation of the external event. So where is the scope for aestheticism, basically? This is what he's railing against. So after skipping few lines, that the time is approaching when the evil will be systematically opposed. How? By men of greater powers and with far more distinguished success. Now, particularly after this paragraph, especially the few lines from this paragraph, critics have found how he also created a kind of idea, not consciously but unconsciously, unintentionally. He created an ideation of a sweeping cultural theory that you'll read in future in literary theories and cultural theories, and one of them being new criticism. Why? Because he was at the threshold of a new century, he was at the threshold of a new time, and he was eager to propose a romantic vision of this modernity, right? So he was also seen as someone who initiated or who contributed much to what later age discoveries of or the documentation of or the theorization of literary theories that happen, that all thanks to Mr. Wordsworth, some contribution made by him. And if you'll notice, it is this unique tension, unique and unintentional one, this unique tension between that very expansive cultural ambitions to introduce a completely new document of aesthetic theory that he introduces through his preface, with the restrictive discipline of poetry. That is something that was new. And if we go through the Poetics again, if we read through this critical document again, the subtext of this poetic theory is nothing but having the elements of discursive, discrete, and disruptive in nature. So I said, let me repeat, that the subtext of the poetic theory of Wordsworth is nothing but it is disruptive in nature, it is discursive in nature, and it has discrete views. And for that external, as part of that critical evaluation of external stimulation or looking for outside events, external events. He considers them as outrageous, he considers them as mind numbing, he considers them as making the mind ultimately lethargic. And he says ultimately that poetic ideal is not restricted, poetic ideal is unconstrained by the shifting economics, the shifting politics, the shifting socio-economic politics of time and place. Right? Now let's continue with the reading of the next paragraph. And I'm going to read from the text directly. Having dwelt thus long on the subjects and aim of these poems, I shall request the reader's permission to apprise him a few circumstances relating to their style, in order, among other reasons, that he may not censure me for not having performed what I never attempted. The reader will find that personification of abstract ideas rarely occur in these volumes. Now, as I said, and as I mentioned, that we have literally delved into the romantic disposition. So Wordsworth is trying to question as well as give the answer that being into romantic ideal doesn't mean that these nature objects will be dealt or given some kind of abstraction, these abstract ideas, or some kind of personification through abstractions. No, he says that this kind of personification doesn't occur in my volume, and they are utterly rejected because they are very normal, commonplace device to elevate or to add to or to contribute to the poetic style and to just distinguish it from the prose part. So let's give it a reading one more time. The reader will find that the personifications of abstract ideas rarely occur in these volumes and are utterly rejected as an ordinary device to elevate the style and to raise it above prose. My purpose was, now these are important lines, my purpose was to imitate and as far as possible to adopt that very language of men, and assuredly such personifications do not make any natural regular part of the language. They are, and my purpose was to imitate, and in what manner, they are indeed a figure of speech occasionally prompted by passion, and I have made use of them as such, but I have endeavored utterly to reject them as mechanical device of style or as a family language which writers in meter seem to lay claim to by its prescription. Now, till now, he has deferred his main argument. I thought he is directly is about to reach onto the final part, onto the key words that are important, but no, he has still deferred it. So he says that my purpose is simply to imitate, to bring as closer as possible in the very language of men, and I don't make much use of these external mechanical artificial personifications because they don't make, these personifications are not the part of someone's colloquial discourse. They're not natural, they're not regular part of that language, right? So these are figures of speech which are occasionally prompted. These are figures of speech which are occasionally spoken, or occasionally whenever someone is in high passion, then they might utter these kind of figures of speech. Otherwise, in regularity, we do not hear people speaking up verse form in hexameters or any other sublime or higher form of metrical technicality. So he says these are indeed a figure of speech occasionally prompted by passion, and I've made use of them as such, but I've endeavored utterly, but ultimately I reject them as mechanical devices, as artificial ones, or as a family language which writers in meter seem to lay claim by its prescription. Now he comes down to what was his key word he was referring to. My purpose was, now I continue from the text. I have wished to keep the reader in the company of flesh and blood. Important words, please underline. I have wished to keep the reader in the company of flesh and blood, persuaded that by so doing I shall interest him. Now let's dwell a bit more on this particular phrase. I have kept the reader in the company of flesh and blood. So first is clearly the observation of facts. Now that's something you all have written in one of the comments, observation, filtering, so on and so forth, whatever you have copied from those blogs. So this is observation is, although rightly said so, first is the loving observation of facts, and then is an astonishing memory of these facts. But there's also a stronger tendency. Now this is here Mr. Wordsworth's theory comes in, and he says, or he believes, that there's also a stronger tendency to soar as in SOAR, as a noun, to rise above. So there is a stronger tendency to soar far above the facts of sense into or moving into the recesses of the mind, where man's unfolding intellect reveals things hidden from the outer eye. Let me repeat it. What he says, that when he says flesh and blood, to present to the reader the facts or the objects in such a manner that the reader be kept in the company of flesh and blood, and by doing so I shall interest him. By doing so in the company of flesh and blood, by this simply he means that even a stronger tendency to soar, to rise far above the facts of sense into or move into the recesses, RECESSES, recesses as in the mind, if it's a labyrinth, to move into different areas of the mind. These facts of sense into the recesses of the mind, where man's unfolding intellect reveal things hidden from the outer eye, right? So by flesh and blood, Wordsworth means that the sweep of imagination, the sublime style, the exalted style, and the atmosphere of sublime emotion is created. And how it is created? When Wordsworth constantly stops to describe even a single most smallest scene by giving it a kind of individual treatment. No matter how typical value it may have for him, no matter how commonplace it may be for him, no matter how simple it might appear, he gives this individual treatment by his sweep of imagination, by his sublime emotion, and the exalted style. And that's the reason you'll find him writing poems on the sunrise, the London city, the simple daffodil or the daisy, the flowers, the butterfly, the cuckoo. So these are the subjects, these are the unassuming commonplaces of nature, unassuming commonplace objects of nature with very homely faces. And their mere choice of them, the very fact that they are being selected as a poetic subject, as a poetic material, it makes it realistic. It makes it very much with the description of its flesh and blood.